Alright, so to kick things off, I think it's very important to go over how FNAF Into the Pit was basically completely overhauled over the course of its development, at least visually. And this is for the simple fact that in the second interview with Dawko, according to series creator Scott Cawthon, the game was not only originally going to be made in a 16-bit Super Nintendo style, but that the game was actually also originally once planned to be available on actual physical Super Nintendo carts that would fully function on real hardware too.
It was just supposed to be a little novelty one-off. It's like, oh yeah, here's this little company that makes 16-bit cartridges, and that was immediately appealing to me because I'm all about the Super Nintendo. And so if I could make something that would come on the Super Nintendo cartridge, sign me up.
Huh, sounds like a good idea. And making their games available on physical carts is part of the developer's shtick that made Into the Pit, Mega Cat Studios. However, the decision was eventually made to move away from the physical cart aspect of this game so more players could play the game on PC and consoles. And don't get me wrong, I definitely get wanting to make the game more accessible, but honestly, I think still having the option of getting this game on Super Nintendo carts would have made for an awesome special edition of the game or something. Anyways, all that to say that although the game's direction was moved from essentially being a Super Nintendo game, there are still numerous leftovers that seem to be remnants of this original design left over in the release build of the game, including sprites of backgrounds, objects, and characters too. So yeah, first we got some unused SNES-style sprites for the living room in Oswald's home. There's the background itself, as well as early versions of several set pieces, including the living room sofa, table and chairs, this lamp, as well as a smaller and bigger cabinet. And then similarly, there's an early Super Nintendo version of Oswald's parents' bedroom, as well as this set of objects like the bed, some shelving, and more meant for it. And also similarly, there are some early SNES graphics for Jeff's Pizza, as well as Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in the past. For Jeff's Pizza in the game's present, there are early graphics for two rooms, Jeff's security room, as well as this hallway that seems to have been scrapped from the game, as there doesn't appear to be an equivalent area in the final cut. But going back to the early security office, what makes this extra interesting is that it appears to have the exact same layout as the office in FNAF 3, right down to the desk with the fan on the left, the garbage can, single door on the left, vent in the upper section on the left, the window is in a similar spot, and of course, probably the biggest similarity is having a box full of FNAF character masks, though here, instead of the toy versions of the characters seen in FNAF 3, we got what looks like some clown masks or something. Maybe a reference to Carnival? Although the final design of the security room in the past is kind of similar, the similarities are definitely more noticeable with the present version of the office. In fact, there's a leftover ability to overlay the old version of the office, as the developers used it as a reference when making this new one. By doing so, we can see how things like the box of masks, trash bin, and desk are all basically in the same place, but Jeff's monitors have now replaced the old window. Interestingly, there's also some sort of mode for the old version of the office where the window would start to glow or something. It's pretty neat. Then also, for all three of these early rooms that I went over, you probably noticed the blank lower third of the sprites, and it's likely that this section of the screen was planned to be reserved for dialogue or perhaps a heads-up display similar to something like what's seen in the original Legend of Zelda. Then next, also for Jeff's Pizza, is an early version of the present ball pit that's central to this game and its title. And as a nice way to transition to the past version of this building, there are sprites left over for an animation of some kids playing in this same ball pit too. Basically the same as is seen when Oswald first emerges from the pit in the past at the start of the game. Then also for the ball pit room, left over unused in the files is an early version of the Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica mural seen there. Yeah, here the animatronics look infinitely more creepy, that's giving me nightmares for sure. And interestingly enough, this mural can be re-implemented into the game too. And in addition to Bonnie being super creepy and purple here, yeah, purple, not blue, he can also be seen holding a different style of guitar, his original Flying V that he used to be depicted playing in earlier games, instead of the other style guitar that he's been using for the last couple of years now. Now, I'm assuming this change was made since the Flying V guitar is made by the Gibson guitar brand. So, much like the other games made over the last few years in the series, in order to avoid any sort of copyright complications, they had to go with the new made-up design. Anyways, next, also for the animatronics, there are several sprites meant for the backstage room, including an early version of Fred Boy himself. There's these shelves with a bunch of animatronic heads of Bonnie, Freddy, and Chica, but interestingly, there are also 2 of the Yellow Rabbit as well. There's this sprite of an Endo 2 with Chica's feet beside it, as well as another pair of Endos with one rocking Chica's head, similar to the one seen in the final version of the backstage. Then, another interesting set of early sprites for the pizzeria are for an animation of the Golden Freddy hiding spot, presumably for when the player would enter and exit it. And what I find more interesting about this is that it looks like Golden Freddy was going to be seen standing as opposed to his iconic sitting position that it was changed to in the final cut. And then lastly, for the background objects in the pizzeria, there are sprites for various arcade machines as well as the ticket eater. These early machines look a lot more generic compared to the ones seen in the final version where they're basically all unique. So this is a change I think was made for the better. Next up, there are early version graphics also thought to be for the Super Nintendo version of other miscellaneous objects, including this Chica toy where there are animations of its eyes shining or something. There's a chunk of cheese, perhaps meant to have been used as part of the rat trap section of the game. And then there's also this blood pressure device, and this is probably related to a scrapped heart rate mechanic in the game. Now, I'll revisit this more when I get around to going over the dev build of the game that was leaked for the Nintendo Switch. But basically, there was a mechanic for when Oswald would hide in the vent where the player would have to move a heart icon up and down to match the heartbeat line that would move across the screen in order to not get detected. Anyways, next, there are early sprites for animations of several of the game's characters. For the animatronics, there's actually only early Super Nintendo sprites for Chica, and these are of her searching under a tablecloth as well as for her running, 2 things that I don't believe she's ever seen doing in the final release of the game. Then for the kids, we have an early version of Chip, or Child 5 as he's referred to in the files, getting scared. And then there are various early sprites of Mike, including an idle animation, him playing skee-ball, looking for something, walking, talking, as well as eating something. Now, what's also noteworthy here is that 2 of these early sprite sets feature Mike with the design on his shirt, while the rest don't. And the ones that don't also have his face shaded differently. I've seen some suggest that this might be a beard, but I think that's unlikely given the likely age of Mike, so it's more likely that this is just shadowing on his face instead. Then next, we of course have a whole bunch of early sprites of the game's protagonist, Oswald, also thought to be remnants from the Super Nintendo version. And these include sprites for numerous animations, including Oswald escaping from something, presumably the Yellow Rabbit, with and without a flashlight, Oz getting in and out of a kitchen counter, him interacting, getting into a locker, hiding under a table from various directions in both a regular and faster version, a pair of animations for him hiding under a bed, him being shocked, getting in and out of a chest, opening the freezer door, apparently opening up a glass door, reaching for something, meant for a cutscene during Night 4, Oswald looking up and getting scared, then sweating and looking back down, a sideways animation of him talking, meant for Night 1, and then there are also animations for 2 actions Oswald can't do in the final cut of the game, blowing a flame in order to melt some ice, as well as jump. Now, the ice melting was something that the player was once supposed to do during Night 2, likely to get another item in the game, probably in the freezer, as that opening animation I mentioned earlier was also meant for Night 2. And then it's unclear if jumping would have been just something that Oswald would do during a certain cutscene, or if it was actually going to be a part of his moveset, but either way, it never ended up getting used. Then lastly, there's also an animation of Oswald getting grabbed and shaken by the Yellow Rabbit. But interestingly here, this is like a blend of styles, as Spring Bonnie here isn't using 16-bit SNES coloring, and for the final frame of this animation, Oswald uses his final design, which is kinda weird to see. And of course, we can't forget about our man Jeff here, and he also has some early animations left over. There are sprites for him talking, walking, and exhaling, looking just as miserable in each of these as ever. I think it's really cool to see all of these early style sprites. Pretty crazy that it looks like the entire game was pretty far along before the decision was made to remake a bunch of the assets. And honestly, I think it's even more crazy that these were still left over in the launch build of the game. And now, for the second half of this video, there are also a whole ton of unused graphics left over in the game from the final style that it took. For starters, there are some early versions of the buildings seen on the game's map screen. We got an old version of the library building where it looks a lot more run down, and honestly, with the large books text, it looks a lot more like a bookstore than a library. Then we also got this early design of the mill, where it looks completely different and has a little water wheel going on in the front here. Next, there's an early version of Oswald's home with a different design, mainly lacking the front porch seen in the final one. And then lastly, there's a graphic for a scrapped town square area featuring a nice little fountain. I guess this was once intended to be an area for the player to visit, but no such area is ever seen in the final cut. And speaking of areas that the player was once planned to visit, apparently there were plans for the player to actually go inside the library instead of just interacting with characters outside of it, as left over in the game is a completely scrapped librarian character that would have presumably been found inside the library. Yeah, a librarian in a library. Checks out. And for this librarian, in addition to idling, we also have animations of her bending over and speaking, walking, as well as adjusting her glasses and dusting off her skirt. So yeah, definitely looks like there were more plans for the library than what we ended up getting. And this makes sense. I think in my first playthrough I only went there like once, so it definitely felt underutilized. And since we're talking about the early buildings, there are actually early gameplay background graphics for them as well. There's an early background version of Oswald's home, which looks quite a bit different, notably having a chimney here, as well as white picket fence out front, which aren't present in the final version of the home. Then we also have day and night sprites for the mill area, obviously rocking the early design that we just went over earlier. This also isn't just the back of the mill as is seen in the final build, and it certainly seems like the original idea was for the player to actually enter inside of it too. And then lastly, we also have an early graphic for the library, where although it looks similar to its final design, yup, like I speculated earlier, it looks like it was originally, in fact, planned to be a bookstore instead of a library. Be it a library or bookstore, it certainly does seem like it was once planned to play a bigger part in the game. Then next up, there are actually leftover graphics for various rooms and objects in the game that appear to be from a style somewhere between the original Super Nintendo version and what we ended up getting in the final cut. For starters, with the school, there are background graphics for the main hallway, where some things, like the blue stripe on the walls and power box here, look similar. Overall, we can see that it looks quite different. And also for the school, left over are some early lockers where they can be seen a bit taller compared to what they look like in the final game. Then onto Oswald's home, we first have an early version of Oswald's room, which notably has its layout flipped compared to the final version. Then we got early background graphics for Oswald's basement, one with the window open, and then one with it closed, and with an added table complete with a nice bloody knife here. Seeing that randomly pop up in the basement honestly would have been pretty cool to see in the game. And then there are also several early objects for the dining room area, including an early version of the calendar, some shelves, a chair, cabinet, as well as a hatch leading up to the attic, which seems to reveal that originally the player would be able to get to the attic from the dining room instead of the one hallway as it was ultimately changed to. Then onto the pizzerias, we got early versions of the ball pit room for both the present, where it looks really basic, as well as the past. Both of these look quite a bit smaller than how the room is seen in the final version, and we can also notably still see the early animatronic mural on the wall here. And interestingly, we can also see the sun and rainbow art on the wall, and this is something that did go on to remain in the final version. So with how this rainbow was near the edge of the room there, we can see just how much this room was expanded. And much like the even earlier ball pit graphic I went over earlier, there's also a slightly updated one, but still different than the final design. And interestingly, you can still enable this graphic in-game to see just how different it is compared to the final design. Also here, and for all of these early rooms, we can see that the entrance is seen as a door on the left side, instead of being towards the player as it's seen in the final. Then also for the ball pit, there are various graphics that were once planned to appear in the foreground, and these appear to be just bigger versions of stuff like the rocking horse and slide that are seen there normally. And there are these early foreground graphics for both the present as well as past version 2. Then, just outside of the ball pit room, if we remove the door that leads to it, we can find a normally unseen little sign there that just reads, Play Area. I assume this was meant to be a sign that would be placed over top of the door to indicate what was inside. Next, we have similar background graphics for the pizzeria basement, again in both a past and present variety. And for the basement, there are also various other unused object sprites, including stuff like a furnace, a shelf, some chairs, a chest, table, a poster of a pea, a golf club, a quill, yeah, I don't know, as well as a pair of seemingly busted arcade machines. And interestingly enough, it looks like this early version of the basement room is actually still left over in the Switch dev build that was leaked. So we'll chat more about it in a future video when I dive more into that dev build. So we talked a bunch about the old security room earlier, but left over in the game for the past version of the room, we also have this sprite of Chica's head. And this is apparently supposed to be the Chica's head that's seen in FNAF 3. And then for the present version, we also have an early version of Jeff's monitors, where their contents can be seen flipped compared to the final version. Then also for the security office, there are sprites for an otherwise unseen night guard suit that seems to have been meant to be used there, and it has this animation of it moving as if it were on a door that got slammed or something. Then for the dining area for Jeff's, we have some early looking graphics of chairs and tables, a menu poster, and then this other graphic that appears to have been an early version of the main stage curtains as well. And similarly, for this customer, seen in Night 2, there's also some early sprites of her chatting on the phone. Then lastly for Jeff's Pizza, there's also this unused secret door that was meant for the arcade room. And this door can actually be re-enabled in the game, and by doing so, we can see it was meant to be hidden behind this arcade machine on the right side of the room. And furthermore, its functionality can be re-enabled too, so you can open it to reveal that this was actually the original way that Oswald was going to enter Afton's room where his dad is trapped, instead of having to go through a vent to get there, and the main door being revealed to be found behind the prize machine in the arcade towards the end of the game. In my first playthrough, I always thought that this peeling wall here was suspicious, and yeah, this is also referred to as Killer Door Tarp. And speaking of the arcade, there are also early versions of basically all of the machines seen there. The changes are often quite minimal, with just better shading or slightly different colors, like yeah, as seen with the Helpulese machine here, the changes aren't huge. But on the other hand, the prize machine also had a few extra changes in the old version, such as missing the Foxy mask, which is good they added it back in, as there's a severe lack of Foxy in the game, as it is. The exotic Butters bowl is smaller in the old version, and there's also these yellow balls in the bottom right. And it seems like you can still see their silhouette in the final version of the machine, and seeing these here now, this looks kinda strange. Then in addition to the early arcade machines, there are also two joystick operated ones that seem to have gotten scrapped. A pretty generic teal one, and then there's also this pink pizza slice one. And now lastly for this first video, there are several unused animations for a bunch of the game's characters. For starters, there are various unused animations of the kids that you save throughout the game. For each of them, except for the first one, there are animations of them being grabbed and shaken, presumably by the yellow rabbit, and then also animations of them being freed from whatever was holding them, with an extra one for the first child where he looks more frightened. Then also for each of the kids, there are animations of them jumping into the ball pit, perhaps suggesting that after you rescued them, you would have had to bring them to the ball pit or something. Then, in addition to those, there are unused animations of Oswald untying Chip from the arcade machine, as well as the hammer on the machine bonking him on the head. There are nervous walking animations for the first kid you save, an unused idle animation, him crying, as well as handing Oswald some keys. What's also interesting about all of these unused sprites for this character is that he can be seen wearing a blue hat, while in the final game, he's always hatless. And it's unclear what these keys would have been for, but honestly, I think this would have fleshed out this character at least a bit more than just seeing him peace out immediately after you rescue him. And the file name for this animation also refers to this child as Trevor, so yeah, I guess Trevor was intended to have been his name. And then there's actually cut content for the cut content here, as there's also some unused dialogue for Trevor here for when he'd give Oswald the keys. He was meant to have said, "I don't have the guts to stick around, but please look for Mark and help him. I hope you find your dad." I don't recall there being any Marks in the game here, so perhaps since the names are similar, Mike used to be named Mark instead. Then for the second trapped child, there's also an unused animation of him crawling out of a cabinet door. And earlier, you also might have noticed that the character that I mentioned for the second trapped child are completely different than the one that's seen in the game. And yeah, that's because I guess before the decision was made to change it to Mike, it was this guy who's apparently known as Cody. Yeah, you remember that one guy from the beginning of the game that's seen playing that one arcade game that's basically never seen again? Yeah, well, in addition to the animations I mentioned earlier, there's also an unused idle animation, him walking nervously, and then to add to that animation of him emerging from the cabinet I mentioned earlier, it's basically exactly how Mike is seen doing after you rescue him. So, based on all of this, and, well, the file names for this character referring to him as Child 2, it does look like Cody here was originally going to be the second kid that you'd rescue. Then after these, we also have some unused animations for Oswald as well as his dad. For starters, there are unused sprites for a cutscene animation of Oswald digging through the ball pit frantically, as well as Oswald's dad shaking his head. Now, although I don't think it's 100% clear where these were to be used, my best guess is that it would have been for a cutscene near the start of the game after the yellow rabbit first grabs Oswald's dad and pulls him into the pit, as there, Oswald would be digging through the pit to find his dad, and then this head shaking may have been meant for after he's pulled out onto the floor. Then, much like the other kids we went over earlier, in addition to all of the early Oswald animations, there are also several that go unused in his final style, well, for the most part. These include Oswald being grabbed and shaken like the other kids with and without a flashlight. And although Oswald does get grabbed by the yellow rabbit in the game, those sprites look different, and then we got him dialing and making a phone call, and then an animation of him apparently pulling the school fire alarm for what appears to be an also scrapped section of the game, as we also have unused sprites for the fire alarm being pulled. Now, this animation of Oswald appears to be identical to the one for him pulling the breaker switch whenever the power goes out in the pizzeria, but the sprites for pulling the fire alarm switch are distinct in the files. Now, I said for the most part earlier, as there's actually one more unused animation of Oswald getting grabbed. And although he looks similar to his final design here, he actually has the bigger, more round nose that was seen in his early design. So this appears to be another case of an in-between style being used. Then next, we also have what looks to be an unused animation of Oswald using the sticky hand. And although similar, the animation that is seen in the game has the hand stretching out much further. And then there's also this animation of Oswald opening a locker, and you may remember these as the old style lockers that we went over earlier. Then lastly for Oswald, there's actually an early version of the interaction prompt left over in the game. Instead of either being a magnifying glass, hiding icon, or bell, as is seen in the final, the old graphic would quite literally just say, interact. And as you can see, this early graphic can actually still be re-implemented in the game too, so we can see it in action as well. Next, we got a rather creepy unused animation of Oswald's dad turning his head a full 180 degrees, before it quickly flashes to turn into the yellow rabbit's head. I honestly wonder at what point in the game this was originally intended to have been used. And then lastly, at least for this part 1, there are some creepy looking sprites referred to only as animatronic head. And apparently, this is a sprite that looks to be based on or reworked from one of Pop Goes the Weasel from the far off time of 2015. In any case, it's currently unclear where this head was going to be used. Alright, so to kick things off here, despite going over a ton of unused sprites in the first video, there are actually a whole bunch more to go over. And to start here, we got several associated with the game's arcade minigames. For starters, there's this early version of the Pizza Roller Skee-Ball game that, yeah, looks quite a bit different than how it's seen in the final cut. And already throwing things back to the first video, this seems to have been from the in-between point in the game's development where the style was being changed from the Super Nintendo style, as this graphic doesn't have the Super Nintendo 8:7 aspect ratio that the other Super Nintendo graphics had. But this obviously isn't as refined as the final version. Now, unless you really like the basic retro design here, personally, I think it's a clear winner which one of these looks better. Then next, there are a few unused sprites meant for the To Be Beautiful secret minigame. So in the final version of this minigame, the player takes control of Eleanor here and has to grant another character, Sarah's, wish of becoming more beautiful, and you do this by essentially putting parts of her together. Well, it looks like the original plan for this minigame was a bit different, as instead of grant her wish, the text was apparently once going to read, put them back together instead. And instead of putting pieces of Sarah together, it looks like the original plan was for the player to put the original animatronics back together, as there are leftover sprites of pieces of Foxy meant for this minigame too. And although only pieces of Foxy are left over for this minigame specifically, there are also fully assembled sprites of Chica, Bonnie, and Freddy as well. But these were all also meant for another minigame too, which we'll touch on more in a bit. Now furthermore, although the sprites were changed, the file names of the pieces of Sarah all actually still reference the other animatronics. Like these heads were for Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica respectively, and then the minigame itself is still internally referred to as Rebuild Them. And then to add to all of that, there's also a leftover audio file referencing Chica meant for this minigame as well, but it's only like a fraction of a second long. So yeah, pretty interesting that this minigame was changed like this, but since To Be Beautiful is a story in the original Into the Pit book that this game is based on, I guess it makes sense to tie this minigame more into that story. Then next, it looks like Old Man Consequences, as seen in one of the endings in FNAF World, was supposed to appear in the Balloon Boy minigame where you grab the hats. So for those that don't know, there's a secret ending to this minigame where after you collect the 5 hats on the main screen, you can hop onto this ledge and go to the left to find some secret rooms. And at the end of them, you normally see Purple Guy dangling the 6th and final hat in the minigame. Well, apparently, there was a plan for the minigame to have a 20% chance of Old Man Consequences replacing Purple Guy, and this is actually still in the game to a point that it can even be re-enabled. And by doing so, we can also see some scrapped dialogue from the fella, apparently here called Scared Man, as he would say, "You fell down the rabbit hole, didn't you? It's not your fault, you didn't know. The others didn't know either. You're a little different from them, you know? You're not trapped yet. Find solace in knowing such. Look to the sky or fall into the pit. The choice is yours." He'll then drop the last party hat, and then you can either grab it, which will result in you falling to your death in the minigame, unless of course you time a tricky little jump, or you can go back to the door on the main screen to win the minigame instead. Honestly, I think this would have been a really cool Easter egg and nice callback to one of my favorite games in the FNAF series. I wouldn't be too crazy about it boiling down to just a 20% chance and think some other requirements to see this would have been better, but either way, I hope this is something that ends up getting added back into the game in the future. And then also for this game, there's an old heads-up display for it that's not only larger and features some different graphics for the controls, but it also reveals a lives system that ended up getting scrapped. Looks like the idea was originally for the player to have 3 lives here, instead of it just being a one and done. And then lastly for the arcade games here, for the secret minigame where you have to pick up balloons, get ready for this. As if Vanny hasn't been cast aside enough as it is, apparently this minigame was originally going to feature Vanny and would have had the player take control of her for it. And furthermore, there's this sprite of Purple Guy also meant for this minigame, as he was apparently planned to command Vanny here. And to support this, there's also unused text graphics of him presumably saying "good girl" to Vanny. In 2 styles actually. And similar to this other one, there's also some unused text saying "save them all." And that's not all for this minigame, as instead of finding balloons, based on the balloon counter and spawning system referring to them as children, it looks like originally the plan was for the player to find children instead, and I guess deliver them to Purple Guy, and that probably explains why this minigame is internally referenced as "lead them," which, yeah, doesn't really make sense for balloons. And to add to that, although hard to see when re-enabled in the game, there's also normally unused "bring them" text left over as well. And like I said earlier, we'll talk about this more in a future video, but there's also a scrapped minigame called Guard Duty, where you have to bring candy to the animatronics to prevent them from escaping, I guess. And here too, originally the plan was for the player to play as Vanny as well. I think it's really cool to see this sprite of Vanny in this style, but at this point, Vanny content being cut from a FNAF game doesn't surprise me at all. Now moving on, next we have several unused graphics left over in the game for various achievements that appear to have been either older versions of the graphics that just ended up getting updated, or the entire achievement itself just ended up getting seemingly scrapped. So for the graphics that just ended up getting updated, first we have this achievement graphic featuring an endo. And this one is an early version for this graphic, as this is apparently Oswald's endoskeleton meant to have been awarded to the player for getting the secret Night 5 ending where you don't fight off the yellow rabbit. Then, related to the icon for the "Who Are They" achievement icon you get for grabbing the strange photo in the party room towards the end of the game, there's this similar graphic with William Afton's face scratched out and Henry scratched out entirely. Due to their similarities, it's also believed that this may have been an old icon for the achievement as well, but its art style also seems to match that what's seen in cutscenes. So although the file name for this picture is just Henry William Photo, since it looks nothing like the menu graphic for it, it's also possible that this was meant to appear on screen after Oswald would pick it up. Or perhaps there were plans for the player to be able to inspect it, similar to the other dad items that you can collect in the game. And then, just as a small aside from the achievements here, while we're talking about graphics that you could inspect after picking up an item, there are several unused pieces of a drawing apparently made by a kid, all titled "Creepy Kid's Drawing." And when put together, we can see that the complete drawing would feature the yellow rabbit, spreading some strawberry jam on the floor. And although going unused in the final game, these scraps of the drawing can apparently be found in some unused rooms left over in the leaked Switch dev build of the game. Then after this, we got an early version of the "Don't Jinx Yourself" achievement featuring some less detailed artwork of Jinx the cat. And then, although not 100% confirmed, there's this graphic for an achievement titled "What Were You Expecting?" And based on that name and these doors, I'm quite confident that this is an early version of the "See Ya Dad" achievement that you get for just leaving the pizzeria in the past early without saving your dad. And then, for the various achievements that seem to have gotten scrapped, next is this unused achievement graphic featuring a rabbit behind a window, referred to simply as Bonnie Window. Yeah, makes sense. And this is apparently for a scrapped achievement for seeing the yellow rabbit in a window somewhere in the game. Presumably Oswald's home, as I think that's the only place in the game that you'd be able to see a character through a window. And yeah, in case you were wondering, the yellow rabbit is simply referred to as Bonnie or Spring Bonnie or even Golden Bonnie, while actual Bonnie is referred to as Purple Bonnie. Yeah, purple, not blue. So this was likely for the yellow rabbit and not for Bonnie. Then, after this, we have some achievements associated with some mechanics that were at least mostly scrapped from the game. First, we'll talk about this more probably in the next video when I go over a developer debug menu that's left over in the game, but basically, there was planned to be an insanity mechanic where, over time, Oswald's insanity level would rise, and as it went up, more and more negative effects would start to apply, like starting to hear children laughing, a heart rate increase, spawning NPCs, a fake Bonnie, and more. And I believe the random phantom jump scares that do occur in the game seem to be a remnant from this mechanic, or at the very least, they would happen more often the higher the insanity level. Anyways, all that to say, there's this unused achievement icon featuring some half yellow rabbit, half brain art, and it's very likely that this achievement was associated with this insanity mechanic as it's titled Going Crazy. Then similarly, we got this icon for a scrapped heart attack achievement. Now in my last video, I mentioned how the heart rate mechanic was something scrapped from the game that's still seen in the leaked Switch dev build of the game when hiding in a vent. But we also got various other unused graphics in the game, as well as references to a heart rate system, and these all appear to suggest that Oswald's heart rate was something that would be related to Oswald's status when being chased or him making a noise. There are graphics for Oswald's heart being in a low, mid, as well as high state, as well as a heart rate monitor with some heartbeat lines. Based on all of this, my theories are that either A, based on these two graphics, this is what the noise mechanic was originally, and that instead of it just being a noise meter, Oswald's heart rate is what would tip off the animatronics to his location, and noises and running would simply cause his heart rate to go up. Or B, based on how these heart graphics are titled, this may have been an old health system that would be split into 3 tiers, similar to how health is handled in the Resident Evil series. Then, after this, we have 2 unused achievements that actually use the same graphic of Oswald and his dad, titled Good Riddance and Out of the Pit, an obvious inversion of both the title and the achievement that you get for first jumping into the pit, so it's likely that these were related to completing the game. Then next, we have this unused achievement titled Generator featuring the power switch, so likely that this was to be awarded after turning the power back on after the generator fails. The Explorer achievement features a book. It's not really clear what the requirements for this one could be. Eavesdropper features a bunch of phones, so it's likely that this one would have been unlocked by listening to all of the phone guy's calls in the game. Collector, based on its name, likely would have had the player collect all of the game's items or arcade prizes. Then we got unused achievements titled Feeling Drained and inversely Feeling Charged, likely for the flashlight running out of battery and the player putting in a new one, respectively. Then also flashlight related, we have a scrapped achievement titled What's This For? And it seems like this may have been for finding a battery in the game before you get the flashlight. Interrupted features a creepy icon of the yellow rabbit, but it's unclear what the conditions for this could have been. Then there's an achievement icon titled Hide and Seek, and it just features the interact icon for hiding in the game. It seems unclear whether this would have been its own achievement that was scrapped, or based on the name similarity, an early version of the Hide and Seek World Champ achievement. And then finally, we also have some achievements all seemingly associated with endings for the game, and similar to some of the ones earlier, it's unclear exactly what these were for, so I'm just gonna speculate some more here. First, we have Hanging On by a Thread, which, based on the icon, was likely for getting the yellow rabbit trapped in the ball pit near the ending of the game. And then we have 2 pretty crazy unused icons. First, there's Dad, Why Dad? Featuring artwork of Oswald's pop and Freddy behind him. And due to his worried expression looking at Freddy and the name itself, Perhaps this was for Freddy unaliving Oswald's dad? Then similarly, lastly for the unused achievements, at least in this style, there's one referred to as It's All My Fault, with Oswald's dad looking quite unwell in the ball pit. Again, based on the name, this appears to, perhaps, have been for an ending where Oswald's dad doesn't make it. Now, this is very speculative, of course, but these last two scrapped achievements definitely seem to suggest that there were other bad endings in the game that were scrapped, where Oswald doesn't end up saving his father. Now, if you thought we were done with the unused achievement graphics, boy, do I have some news for you, as there are a whole bunch more. But this time, we have even earlier icons where they have a completely different pixel art style and, well, actual color. And again, first, for those that appear to be older versions of other achievement icons, we got one for an achievement titled Get to Safety, featuring a graphic of a glowing-eyed Freddy, and based on the name, this could be an old icon for the It's Me achievement for hiding in the golden Freddy suit near the start of the game. Then I mentioned this sprite in my first video, but it turns out it's actually an early icon for an achievement titled Blood Pressure, likely related to the heart attack achievement and scrapped heart rate mechanic we went over earlier. There's an even earlier icon for the Feeling Drained achievement, an early version of the Master of Stealth icon featuring presumably Oswald wearing a hood. We got an early version of the Impatient achievement icon sporting TLDR on the button that's missing on the final version. Then we have an icon for a Game Master achievement, which seems to be an early version of the Not a Gamer achievement for completing all of the arcade games. And then we also have 3 early icons for presumably getting the 1, 2, and 3-star endings in the game, all titled Take the High Ground in either an easy, normal, and hard variety, likely referring to a difficulty level. Then, for achievements that seem to have been completely scrapped, first we have Hello Operator, which, based on the name, my theory is that this may have been for trying to call the operator to determine Oswald's mom's phone number. Then, we got a cut achievement titled That's How They Get You, featuring an icon of a bear trap, and similarly there's Quick Memory, featuring a closed bear trap with a question mark. Now, although these may not necessarily mean that Oswald was supposed to get his leg chomped on by some bear traps, these may indicate that there were going to be some sort of traps laid around the game that Oswald could step on, and then the player would have to do something to escape them. I guess maybe something similar to how Bonnie grabs you in the final cut of the game. And then lastly, for the unused achievement stuff, we have one for the To Be Beautiful arcade game sharing its name featuring a necklace. Now, if you aren't familiar with the story, basically, Eleanor, the animatronic that you play as in the arcade game, gives a girl named Sarah a necklace to grant her wish of becoming beautiful. And this is the necklace that's seen in the end of the minigame, and obviously this achievement icon would have been referencing that. And although all of those are the only achievement sprites in this style that are left over individually with associated naming, there's a whole sprite sheet for all of these early achievements where we can see a few more of them. And there's also leftover data for some of them, so we can kinda piece together what they were. We got a cell phone with a 911 blocked, and this looks to be an early graphic for the Who Ya Gonna Call achievement for attempting to call 911. Then we have this juiced up battery, again likely an early version of the scrapped Feeling Charged achievement. Similarly, next we have a basic looking flashlight with a battery, and this appears to be an early version of the What's This For achievement for getting the battery before the flashlight. Next, we got this achievement icon featuring a hat and number 1 dad text on it, and this appears to be an early version of the Out of the Pit achievement for rescuing Oswald's dad. And then lastly, we have sprites of a single VHS tape as well as a collection of 5, and I couldn't really find any names associated with these. Now, there aren't any collectible VHS tapes in the final cut of the game, but there is one that appears on the security desk in the past version of the pizzeria. So perhaps that might be a remnant of these achievements. Either way, it looks like VHS tapes used to be a collectible in the game that ended up getting scrapped along with these 2 achievements. Overall, honestly, I think the art style for these early achievement icons is quite a bit better than the minimalist style that we ended up getting in the final cut of the game. And then, although their graphics aren't unused, a few of the file names appear to reveal early names for their associated achievements. The icon for the Gimme 5 achievement for collecting all 5 of the dad items is referenced as 5 items at Daddy's. Sugar Rush is listed as Candy Candy Candy. Hello 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 is referred to as a message for you. And lastly, the achievement for getting all of the other achievements, Looking to the Future, is simply known as 100% whatever. Now obviously, 5 items at Daddy's sounds kinda weird, but the other changed names I think are pretty intriguing. So I mentioned a bunch of unused sprites and animations for the human characters in my first video, but we also got some unused sprites and animations for the animatronic fellas as well. For starters, there's this really broken down version of Fredboy, with an eyeball and arm on the floor beside him. This sprite looks quite similar to the broken Freddy animatronic seen in the backstage room, though with some seemingly more basic shading and obviously more decay. Then next, we actually have sprites for unused jump scare animations for Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica. Now these don't appear to be fully unused, as like a frame of each of them seems to be used in the random phantom jump scares that occur in the game. Well, at least for Freddy and Chica. Personally, I don't think I've gotten Bonnie's. In any case though, the rest of the sprites for these animations appear to go unused. Bonnie's also appears to be split into 2 sections, with him starting to grab the player and then actually doing the scare. And then, although Chica is seen wearing her bib and Bonnie his bow tie, Freddy's animation has him not only lacking his bow tie, but also his hat. Then another pretty interesting tidbit for Freddy's animation here is that it appears to have been based on Bonnie's jump scare from the original Five Nights at Freddy's game. And although only seemingly partially used with the phantom jump scares, the file names of these refer to them as intro and general jump scares, suggesting that maybe these were early versions of their jump scares for when you're first introduced to all the animatronics, and their general jump scares that would occur if you were caught by them. And then last but not least, the main animatronic of this game has some unused animations as well. These include the yellow rabbit opening a door and motioning for Oswald to follow him, and if we look closely, we can see the purple hallway behind him. And if you watched my first video, you may remember that this looks to have been in Oswald's home. Then we have an animation of the rabbit like feeling up some object in the background, one of him peeking through a door, similar to the tease at the start of the game, though obviously not obscured in the shadows here. Then we have a pair of unused animations for the game's ending, one of him seemingly taking a hit, lunging at the player and taking another hit, and then an animation of the yellow rabbit tripping into the ball pit and getting tangled in the netting seen in the gameplay style, rather than the cinematic cutscene style that ended up being used in the final cut, which honestly, I think that one looks quite a bit better. And then, in addition to all of these unused animations for the yellow rabbit that seem further along, there are also some early unfinished animations too. These include one for the rabbit's hand extending from the ball pit, a very basic early version of the rabbit lifting up the tablecloth for a table hiding spot. Then we have an even more basic looking animation of the rabbit looking for the player in another hiding spot where like 80% of the graphic is unfinished to say the least. Based on there being an emphasis on only a slit being visible, it's likely that this was an early version of the rabbit looking for the player in the closet hiding spot. And then lastly, we have another early seeking animation, this time for the player hiding in the golden Freddy suit. And this appears to use an incredibly early art style that looks quite a bit different than anything seen in the game. And interestingly enough, this animation uses the same 8:7 aspect ratio as the Super Nintendo, so it's likely that this was put together back when the game was planned to release on Super Nintendo carts. And honestly, I think the yellow rabbit looks a bit more unsettling this way. Alright, so to kick things off here, we went over the scrapped implementation of Old Man Consequences in my previous video, but there are actually a few more characters that were complete with dialogue that were cut from Into the Pit as well. For starters, we got this guy. Yeah, this unused purple tie wearing bear fella is simply referred to in the files as Bear Mascot, but dialogue for him also just names him Guy in Bear Suit, dispelling that this might be an animatronic just chilling and waiting for his lunch. And for this totally not Freddy Fazbear, there's an idle animation of him sitting at a table, as well as talking in both a more polished and what looks to be an early design. There's also this other talking animation for him in the earlier looking design where he doesn't open his mouth, and it's honestly kinda creepy. And although just speculation, it's possible that this scrapped bear may have been Papa Bear, or at least a reference to him from Papa Bear's Pancake House, the restaurant's name sometime after it was Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and before it became Jeff's Pizza. In any case though, this bear mascot was planned to have appeared in the present version of Jeff's Pizza on day 4, and he even has some leftover dialogue in the game that was supposed to be associated with him which can actually still be re-enabled. When interacted with, he was going to say, "The wait for my pizza has been unbearable. Get it, kid?" And then there's also dialogue for when the player is tasked to find a way to lure Freddy out of the security office, for which Oswald would ask, "Excuse me, do you know anything about a robot bear?" To which the mascot would respond, "A robot bear? Well, I know there used to be one around town before. You should check out the local library. I'm sure the librarian there would know more." Now, if you've watched my previous videos, you'll remember that we discussed the scrapped librarian character and likely plans for the player to have actually entered the library instead of just interacting with the characters outside of it. And yeah, I guess this is the part of the game where Oswald was intended to go into the library to chat with the librarian, who would have presumably offered Oswald advice on how to lure out Freddy. Honestly, I think this would have been a pretty interesting section in the game, but I guess the trade with Jet is basically the same thing, just with less context. I think in my first playthrough, I just went to the library on a whim and got lucky. But apparently, you're supposed to just remember that Jet hangs around the library after school from like 2 days ago in the game, so I definitely think that this scrapped segment would have offered better guidance and context. And then after this we have another scrapped character, this time meant to have appeared in the past version of the pizzeria, and this was going to be another employee there, I guess essentially acting as a past version of Jeff before animatronic hell breaks out in the pizzeria. Anyways, this scrapped unnamed fella, just referred to as employee, was going to appear in an equally unused room known as Counter, which appears to be an old version of the entrance room to the pizzeria seen in the game with a bigger counter, different object placement, and a smaller employees only door that I guess was changed to the large doors to the arcade which are seen in the final version. Oh, also there's a phone in this version that doesn't appear in the final cut, which may have been for another phone guy message. We'll talk more about these unused rooms that were found in the leaked dev build of this game probably next video, so back to the employee here. For a scrapped, seemingly minor character, he actually has quite a bit of associated dialogue that was scrapped along with him. He would normally say, "Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, may I take your order?" To which Oswald would say, "This guy looks weirder than Jeff." When asked if he knows any good places to hide, the employee would say, "Not near the animatronics. Trust me, kid, they smell terrible." Oswald was going to ask him about opening a door, to which he'd say nope, that he was in the kitchen. And apparently, this employees only door up here was going to be a door to the kitchen, as if Oswald were to interact with it, the employee was going to say, "Sorry, customers aren't allowed in the kitchen. Looking for a summer job, kid?" To which Oswald would mention his age of 10, and then the employee would have said, "So, you should see the weirdos we hire for our security guards." I guess this being a little fourth wall breaking dig at us, the players, of the older Five Nights at Freddy's games. Anyways, yeah, with the counter area being reworked, I guess it was decided to chuck this guy out along with the older style. Now next, as if we haven't chatted about enough unused graphics as it is, there's actually a bunch more to go over. To start, I mentioned the early designs of the mill, library, as well as Oswald's home in my first video, but it turns out that you can actually still re-enable the original old background graphics in the release version of the game in both the night and day varieties. So we can still get a basic idea of how it was once planned to appear, although unfortunately we still can't enter inside the mill or anything. But it is pretty cool to re-enable Oswald's original home design and still see the picket fences and such. And then, in a similar fashion, and also similarly to the security rooms I mentioned in the first video where you could re-enable the original layout for the room that was used as a reference from the original Super Nintendo plans for the game, there are also various early sprites for the kitchen area that are still kicking around as well. The differences certainly aren't as drastic as what was seen with the security rooms, and although most things are in the same or similar spots to where they are in the final version of the kitchen, we can still see the older, more basic looking sprites for things like the counters, and more noticeably, the fridge here. And we can also see other old sprites left over in other rooms throughout the game, and there's honestly a lot of them, so I'll save the rest for the next video. And then to add to all of this, there's actually an unused sprite of Oswald holding some sort of tablet. And based on it being referred to as mini-map frame, I suppose this was going to be meant for inspecting the maps. Now, before we go on, just wanted to quickly give a shout out to my channel members like Lieutenant Yellow and Pulterbit. If you're enjoying my content and would like to help support the channel, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. It really helps me out a lot, and you'll get some extra channel perks to boot. Anyways, next, although there are more unused rooms left over in the early dev build of Into the Pit that was leaked on the Nintendo Switch, which we'll go over in a future video, there's actually one normally inaccessible room left over in the full release here, and that's for the present or future version of the party room in the pizzeria. You access the past version in the game towards the end of it to reach Oswald's dad, but the room is completely sealed off in the present, and as such you can't ever normally enter it. Unfortunately, however, despite still having a loadable area dedicated for it, it's essentially just an empty room here. The existence of this area may suggest that there might have been at least some plans for it, but whatever they may or may not have been, they weren't ever realized. So we just got an unused leftover room with a whole lot of nothing. Now, moving along, next we got numerous additional unused sprites to go over. Well, for starters, they aren't technically unused since you can see them at the start of the game when selecting the game's difficulty and some other parameters and such. These icons of the animatronics deteriorating are seen in a basic white outline style. But in the files of the game, we also have these icons of all the animatronics in full color that, at least to my knowledge, aren't ever seen like this, and honestly, I think they look really good this way. Then similarly, back to the truly unused graphics, we have some additional icons for Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica, and although similar, based on their file path, these appear to have been intended for the animatronics sketchbook that's given to Oswald by Gabrielle. Next up, in my previous video, I partially went over the game's scrapped heart rate mechanic and mentioned how I think it was the original system for how the yellow rabbit would track down Oswald before it was changed to the sound meter, as well as the equally scrapped insanity mechanic for Oswald, in which the more insane he'd get, the more negative effects would start to appear. Well, it looks like there are some more unused graphics related to these left over in the game. So I briefly went over the low, medium, and high heart level graphics, but there's also this heart as well as heart rate monitor that was going to be used for the scrapped heart rate mechanic as well. And based on its art style, it's likely that it was planned to be seen in the pause screen as it has that same sketchbook style. And in a similar style, we also have this brain graphic that too was likely to have been used in the pause screen, perhaps to indicate Oswald's insanity level. There's a flashlight, likely indicating remaining battery life, as well as a speaker, perhaps indicating current sound level or something. Now next, there are several icons that were apparently supposed to have been used for tutorial screens that would have popped up throughout the game for various mechanics. For the insanity mechanic, we have another brain icon, as well as yet another brain icon, this time in the shape of a rabbit rocking a bow tie, likely indicating a higher level of insanity, and this would check out with the scrapped insanity achievement icon that I went over in my previous video, as it looks pretty similar. Then also we have this icon of Oswald looking nervous, as well as one of him grabbing his head and screaming, both likely from going insane. Then we also have unused icons of Oswald walking as well as running, in two styles actually, one more simplistic one, and then one more stylized to Oswald's likeness. Then we also have a map, two different designs for the flashlight, as well as a battery, indicating that there were apparently going to be tutorial screens for all of these teaching the player how to use them. And furthermore, the heart rate mechanic icons of Bonnie being alerted and chasing the player that we went over in the last video are also found here amongst the other tutorial graphics, suggesting that they too were part of a tutorial screen. Then after this, we actually have an almost unreasonable amount of scrapped icons related to, I guess, the breathing minigame that's used when hiding in the Golden Freddy suit. We have icons for Oswald inhaling and exhaling from a frontal perspective, a pair from the side, and then we have a few different graphics for the lungs themselves that go unused, including a blank set, a pair in a slightly different looking style, as well as a colored version that of course never gets seen. Then strangely, this set of icons for the breathing mechanic also has these eyes, I guess perhaps indicating whether or not the yellow rabbit could see Oswald inside the suit. Now ultimately, the tutorials that are seen in the game are quite basic with just a quick prompt that appears on screen, so I guess the decision was made to make the tutorials less intrusive without having a big tutorial graphic pop up on screen. Then after this, we also have some unused icons for what looks to be a battery life meter that would have of course displayed the remaining battery life, instead of it just being hidden with only some flickering lights as an indication that the battery is running low. Personally, I didn't really end up using the flashlight much during my playthrough, but I think having a meter would have been nice. Then after that, we have what looks to be an old icon for interacting with the hiding spot that would feature Oswald instead of a generic looking fella. And then there's an early version of the warning screen seen at the start of the game. Now next up, we got unused graphics left over in the game for a whole bunch of items, either some that ended up getting updated graphics, or others that seem to have gotten cut from the game entirely. Well, first, we actually have an unused background graphic, which based on its file name, I guess this folder-like background was once intended to be used for displaying the game's items. Then after this, we have several seemingly early sprites for various items, including a rusty-looking key in an upright and angled variety. Then following this trend, we also have what looks like a yellow rabbit plushie, as well as what I can only describe as a cage or net or something, as well as a blue and red key, also in upright and angled styles. Then next we got a pizza box, a moldy pizza slice that, unlike most of these other leftover items, does actually have a name, Rotten Pizza, a lunch bag that looks pretty similar to the one that's used in the final version, a bit of rope, a spool of metal referred to as magnesium. Then there's some sort of aerosol spray can, as well as what looks to be a lighter, perhaps meant to have been associated with that unused animation of early Oswald blowing a flame to melt something in a section of the game that was scrapped. Then we have an early flashlight, as well as not one, not two, but 3 different iterations of the batteries. Next, we have a pair of sprites for some pliers, and since the game actually references the part where you need to find a screwdriver as grab pliers, it looks like pliers were originally going to be used to free the first trap child instead of a screwdriver. Then we have 2 different party horns, one yellow one and one purple, a VHS tape that, as we went over in my last video, seemed to be collectible items in the game that were scrapped. And then lastly, for these early looking items, we actually have 2 sprites for a phone. Now these appear to be more of a modern looking smartphone rather than the older cell phone that is used in the game. And this seems to suggest that the present time in the game may have once been planned to be closer to current day than in the late 90s, early 2000s era, which it appears to take place in based on the old phone and CRT TV. Then to top things off for these items, there's also this unused sprite referred to as item slot, suggesting that an item would be assigned on it to, I guess, use it during gameplay or something. And then to wrap things up for the items, there are also several unused graphics for them in the style in which they are seen in the inventory screen on the pause menu, including some for a few of the items that we just mentioned. Now, I haven't played through the game in every possible permutation, so some of these might be used somewhere, so please correct me if they are, but I haven't seen them anywhere myself. So anyways, we have normally unused graphics for a milk crate, which based on its description may have been for Oswald standing on it or something to reach a higher point. A metal pipe, which based on its description being similar to that of the hammer, may have perhaps been a way for Oswald to try and open the freezer door. There's actually an unused alternate graphic for Bonnie's guitar that looks quite similar, just being less detailed. And similarly, although the graphic itself is the exact same, there's a second version of Meacham's book where the text description is just slightly spaced differently. And also similarly, there are actually two versions of Oswald's mom's phone number, even though they appear the exact same. Then we have the rotten pizza, pliers, and lighter items that we just went over earlier, as well as this hairspray item, which I guess was that aerosol can from before. Then we got a cable piece, a wooden crate that was apparently trashed by Jeff, a pizza cutter that still has a bit of dried green pepper on it, a glass shard, a box of stuff, a toolbox, some sort of note item without a description, steel rope, which may be the magnesium item from earlier, a special token variant with a paw print on it instead of the $sign seen on regular tokens. There's an unused keychain item, a part of the scrapped drawing that I went over in the previous video, and then lastly we once again see the scrapped VHS tape item, as there's actually not only one unused graphic for the inventory screen, but also this similar looking one in a slightly different style. Seeing as how so many of these items have graphics made up for the inventory screen, and some even also having some text descriptions, it really seems like they may have been cut from the game closer to release here. And yeah, with how many leftover graphics there are for the VHS tapes, it really makes me curious as to what exactly their role in the game was going to be. Then moving on, next up we have an unused graphic featuring a bunch of bloody hands. Now these hands were intended to be used on the title screen in the ball pit around the Yellow Rabbit, suggesting that these hands are of several victims. And also for the title screen, there's this early version graphic of the Yellow Rabbit's head meant for it as well. After this, we have this unused jukebox graphic featuring a drawn style that isn't really seen elsewhere in the game. I don't think it's known where exactly this was intended to have been seen, but one theory is that it may have been meant for the sound test-like music section in the extras section of the main menu. Then next, we got a pair of rather interesting graphics that again don't seem to align with the rest of the game's art style. Now you've all heard of Fire, but let me introduce you to Fire 2, the simple name of this fiery texture that I don't believe gets used anywhere in the game. And then probably the silliest unused graphic left over in this game is this realistic image of an arm doing a bicep curl, simply known as arm. Yup. And if we enhance the image a bit, we can see this Resident Evil 5 Chris Redfield looking arm is curling what looks to be a measly 20 kilograms, or about 45 pounds in freedom units. All jokes aside, it's probable that this image was used as a reference when making the sprites for the Heftin with Helpules minigame. Then next, we got some unused animations for these posters, in which the animatronics actually blink. And I can only assume that this was going to be one of the visual ailments that would occur with Oswald's insanity at a high level with that scrapped mechanic. And now lastly for this video, there are actually several unused security monitor screens left over in the game. And these aren't just regular old screens either, but rather they seem to be of an area that looks incredibly similar to the pizzeria from the original Five Nights at Freddy's game. The existence of these strongly suggests that they may have been part of a scrapped security cam section in the game that would be a throwback to the first FNAF, and honestly, this would have been really cool. Now personally, I feel like the security camera function in the release version of Into the Pit feels very underbaked and honestly not very useful, especially given how hard it is to even see anything on the cameras. And in addition to these monitor screens, there's also an unused animation of the yellow rabbit walking and then seemingly turning towards one of the cameras, perhaps to set up a jump scare similar to the camera one that is used in the game. And this is actually very likely, as there's also an unused animation of this hallway shaking for a jump scare. And if we overlay the yellow rabbit animation that is used normally in the regular security camera jump scare, we can see how it matches up pretty much perfectly. In any case, this definitely seems like a missed opportunity to make better use of the security cameras, in addition to it being a cool reference to the original game. Now, I don't know if this is something that would ever end up getting re-added to this game, but at the very least, we have these graphics left over to see what could have been. Alright, so in my previous videos, I mentioned how there are various old background graphics and objects left over in some rooms, like the kitchen area, ball pit, and security offices, as well as outside of a few of the buildings. So to kick things off for part 4 here, let's go room by room through the rest of the game and chat about a whole bunch of graphics that are still left in the scene, but for one reason or another, the decision was made to hide them in the game. Well, at least the more interesting ones. I think if I was to talk about every single sprite that's hidden, I'd be here all day. And what better place to start than on the main menu screen? Although there's nothing really on the actual main menu here, if we go into the Achievements sub-menu, there's actually a hidden graphic that reveals that originally, it looks like the achievements were going to be seen on a coiled booklet of sorts instead. And this has me wondering if the entire main menu used to have a completely different TV-less style like this too. Then for the transition screens you see in the game when going between areas, left over hidden is actually an early, much more basic version of them. Yeah, as you can see, originally the screen would have been mostly blank with just small text indicating the location and day you were at. It's basic, but I kinda dig the simplicity to be honest. Then moving on to the actual gameplay sections, first, I'ma be real with you. Outside of the early library and old mill backgrounds I mentioned earlier, there really isn't much of anything for either of these two areas. Well, for the old mill, there's actually this hidden fence here, and honestly, it fits pretty well. And then there's not much more for the school. One of the classrooms has some unused shelves and books and such, and there's also a side door meant to be seen here instead of the one that's normally used towards the front of the area. And lastly, in the main hallway, we can actually re-enable some railings by the main door that look quite basic, suggesting that they may be a remnant from the original plan to develop this game for the Super Nintendo. Anyways, with those areas not being very fruitful, that leaves us with Oswald's home and the pizzeria, which, yeah, makes sense since that's where you spend like 95% of the game. So first, let's begin with Oswald's house, and first, Oswald's room. Now this will be true for almost all of the rooms in this home, but there are leftover early versions of various objects where, like here for example, we can see that not only is their coloring and shading different, but oftentimes they are also offset in a slightly different spot. Sometimes by only a pixel or two, but other times it's a bit more, like with this toy phone here. And I also mentioned the bigger early foreground graphics in my previous videos, but these also appear in almost every room in the game. For the most part, I don't think many of them are all that interesting, but they do tend to show that there was once a slightly different visual perspective planned for the game, with these bigger objects in the foreground. So yeah, I'll mostly just be skipping through these in this video unless there's something a little more interesting, but I just figured I should mention how prevalent these are. Anyways, back to Oswald's room here. Most of the hidden objects appear the same, with just different coloring, like I said, but we also have a hidden early version of this rack thing here that's a different color and looks much more basic. And then, I'm not sure if it's completely unused or just a low-chance Easter egg, but behind this Godzilla poster, there's also one for another Five Nights at Freddy's book, the Twisted Ones. Also, another thing I should mention is that we'll be seeing a strange amount of guitar removals from this home, and it starts here with a guitar that would have appeared on the bottom right of this room. Then moving on to this first hallway in the home, toggling the unused sprites, we can immediately see a duplicate of the wardrobe thing here offset quite a bit under the floor, which is pretty weird to see like this. Then we got two more interesting things here. There's an unused lamp that would have appeared on the right side of this room, and then there's actually an alternate version of the dresser here, that instead of a sewing machine would have had some sort of plant instead. And if this dresser and plant look familiar, it actually appears to be the same one that was seen in the Super Nintendo style of Oswald's parents' bedroom that I went over in the first video. And on that note, next let's go to that room, and there are actually quite a few changes here. For starters, there's an early version of the house coat. It looks like the light switch was originally going to be beside it. There's an early version of the dresser that's slightly offset from the floor. Then we got differently colored and shaded sprites of the plant and chair here, and then there's also a seemingly early version of the family portrait above the bed, where Oswald's dad looks a bit cross-eyed, so I'm not surprised it was updated. Then probably the most interesting thing for this room is that there's a whole other set of unused graphics that can be re-enabled, and by doing so we can see older furniture and even older picture above the bed that was not of Oswald's family but of some buildings. And additionally, this looks to bring back various objects like the placement of these posters, dressers, and guitar exactly how they were seen in the layout planned for the original Super Nintendo version of this room. And to add to that, there are also these like reference lines that can be re-enabled that seem to have used the original Super Nintendo stuff as a reference. Similar, I guess, to the reference image used for the security office that I went over in previous videos. And there's not just one guitar here that was removed from this room, but actually a second one that looks to have been replaced by the mirror in the corner here. And then lastly for this room, one more remnant from the old design is a ceiling fan that's not only still left in the game, but it's fully animated too. And to add to this, there's also a hanging light left over as well. But ultimately, in the final version, I guess the developers didn't want anything spinning or swinging on the ceiling, so they removed both. Anyways, much like the old security office stuff, I thought it was really cool to see the Super Nintendo remnants in this room, and it's interesting to see how different, yet similar, this room turned out to be. Then after this, we have the other hallway room, and here, once again, we can see a second unused wardrobe left over under the floor. Next, we got the dining room, where the old hidden sprites reveal a larger calendar, removal of the radio and lights, as well as more basic looking bottles and jars here. Then for the living room, we can see different placement of the family portrait in the background with slightly different coloring too. Different placement for the couch and table, and then we have our final case of, I guess, the developers hating guitars, as there's a fourth one that was once planned to be seen here in the bottom left of the room as well. The kitchen area didn't really seem to have anything crazy besides some slightly more interesting unused foreground graphics like this large spatula on the right here, as well as this metal cart thing, which I believe is actually a leftover from the pizzeria kitchen area. So next, let's move on to another room with better hidden stuff, the attic. Here, unused objects include this little basket in front of the rocking chair, a book on the floor, a bottle between those two, a bunch of boxes, then also under the window there's an unused chair, as well as what looks to be a little golden Freddy plushie. Then there's this thing on the floor that I can only describe as a clock or something. Then we got two items which can be re-enabled behind the rocking horse here, a lava lamp as well as a gramophone that's referred to as a musics box in the files. And lastly for this room, there's also another unused light switch that would have appeared on the back of the room here. And this would have actually let you flick on or off the light in this room, unlike in the final version where the light is just always off or on at night. And I guess while we're here, for those that are wondering, the objects are basically all the same in both the day and night versions of each of these rooms, at least in most points in the game. There are some exceptions, like the bear mascot guy that I mentioned in my last video, which are only seen on certain days. Anyways, last up for Oswald's home here, we have the basement, but unfortunately, aside from different coloring and this early table here, there's not really anything else of note, so now let's move along to the pizzeria section. To start here, in my previous videos I covered the early versions of the outside areas of the other buildings, but there's actually an early version of the pizzeria here too, where it looks more or less similar, but with no logo, different coloring, and the awnings are completely flat, lacking any sort of depth seen in the final red version. Then heading inside, first we have the front counter room, and here we have some hidden pizza graphics on the back wall. And then behind the fridge, we can find several objects, including an unused set of doors, a bench, as well as a sign with some text that I think says up, maybe for pizza pickups or something. Then in both the present and past versions of this room, there are hidden plants meant to have been seen in the corner where the counter is. Then, seemingly exclusive to the past version of this room, we got a pair of different looking party table graphics that are quite a bit bigger. And more interestingly, there's an otherwise unseen wanted poster featuring what looks to be Circus Baby. And then, although I believe the Basketball Freddy posters are seen in other parts of the pizzeria, there was one meant to have been seen above the vent here, and it actually still also has interactability left over, and if Oswald were to interact with it, the poster would read, "Freddy congratulates the 1985 high school basketball champions, Westbrook High School." To which Oswald would note that that was decades ago. I guess this was going to be a pretty similar reveal of the time period, much like the calendar in the storage room. Next up, we have the arcade room, and here we have a bunch of stuff, including an old arcade sign, or Arc Dead in the present version of it. And then, there are actually a few unused arcade machines that are found in the same spot as this bench that's here in the final version of this room. But if we remove some stuff, we can see that these are actually the two otherwise unused arcade machines that I went over in my first video. Besides these, there's also another glowing screen, but it doesn't have a full cabinet like the other two, well, at least not in the same spot. There's another unused arcade cabinet here that looks to be similar to the Bonnie and Freddy machines, but with less branding, that based on the outlines here, this screen looks to have been meant for that. Moving on to the party room hallways, in the present version there's a whole bunch of early party stuff like tables, balloons, and streamers and such, and on the right side here we can see the horn graphic that I believe is otherwise unused, as I mentioned in my last video. And also in the back right here, there's an unused set of wet floor objects, including a mop, a bucket, a sign, as well as, well, a puddle. Then in the past version of this hallway, there's also various hidden posters, and more importantly, a whole bunch of chairs, tables, balloons, and presents which were removed from the background here, and honestly, that was probably a good call, cause this would have made the room feel pretty dang tight for space. Then for the party room itself, the past version doesn't have much, and the present version still has nothing. But interestingly, behind the background wall, they both still have the old Super Nintendo style security room graphic left over here, I guess seemingly again as a reference. From here, let's go to the dining area, and for a room as big as this, it unfortunately doesn't have all too much left over. Like, I was hoping there would be something revealed with the Foxy section here, but instead, all we got are some early tables and posters in both past and present styles. Well, at least that's mostly it for stuff inbounds. Another pretty wild thing I found is that if you remove the background in this room, you can sometimes find a duplicate yellow rabbit just chilling in the void in an idle animation. I also noticed that this was just behind a table that Bonnie was hiding under, but I thought it was just a coincidence. But it turns out that if you do get grabbed by Bonnie, the yellow rabbit in the background will also start to go through an animation of grabbing and shaking Oswald as well, for a few seconds before both disappear. Now these are obviously connected some way, but I'm not 100% sure how. My best guess is that maybe, originally the yellow rabbit was going to hide under the tables and shake Oswald if he got too close instead of Bonnie. Whatever the case may be though, this was pretty cool to find here. Then next, onto the backstage area. In both the past and present versions of the room, hidden are several of the old animatronic graphics I mentioned in previous videos, as well as this shelf full of old animatronic heads. And then, in addition to all of that, if we remove most of the objects, we can actually uncover these super old dining area graphics of the table and old curtain that I went over in part 1. Kinda interesting to see it in this room. I definitely would have expected it to be found in the dining area instead. Next, we got the basement rooms, and first off, it looks like there was a light that was planned to be here, which was scrapped. But I guess the devs wanted to keep these rooms extra dark to almost force the player to actually use the flashlight. And then, probably the most interesting part of this room is that left over are the various early objects like the arcade machines, table, and this poster that I mentioned in my first video. And even more than that, the old basement background graphic is hidden here too, though unfortunately all of the objects aren't aligned with the old background, so it doesn't exactly look all too great to say the least. These objects are also left over in the present version of the basement where they seem to fit a bit better. Oh, and here we also have some boxes of animatronic scraps that look pretty creepy, as well as this teeny tiny little hammer here. And then, last stop for our hidden object ride here, we have the storage room. In the present version, we got a few normally hidden things, including a stack of gifts, a speaker from the past version of this room, one of the early posters I mentioned in my previous video, an early light, there's a smaller, older looking vent sprite in the middle of the room, and then on the left side, we can also uncover an early sprite for the stack of TVs. And finally, for the past version, we actually have a few other things, most of which are actually like stacked on top of each other here. And this stack includes a chair, a box, presents, some balloons, as well as a trash can thing. But that's not all, as the most interesting thing about this room, at least I think, is that there is a hidden background that appears to reveal that this room was once planned to be much longer. And I'm just gonna go ahead and spoil a part from the next video here, but yeah, as revealed in some early maps that are left over in the leaked dev build, the storage room was in fact once much longer. But anyways, left over in the final version of the game here, we have some more presents, posters, and most notably, there is a second Golden Freddy costume here that, with the lighting at this angle, honestly looks pretty cool. Now before we go on, just want to give a shout out to my wonderful channel members like SRG4 and Ben CD. If you're enjoying my videos and would like to help support the channel, please consider becoming a channel member today by clicking the join button below and get yourself some extra channel perks. And now for the second part of this video. I've been teasing it for the last 3 videos, but now let's finally get to going over the normally unused debug menu that's still left over in the game. We got a whole bunch of stuff here, so let's start from left to right. First, and probably the most useful toggle on this menu, is the ability to enable God Mode, and much like in other games, enabling this will make Oswald invincible to the Yellow Rabbit. So he can cope and seethe all he wants, but he ain't getting any jump scares in. Well, that is unless you decide to try and hide somewhere, which I guess disables the invincibility for a bit. And skipping forward, in a similar fashion on the menu, you can also toggle the Yellow Rabbit's activity, which if you set him to inactive, he'll leave you alone and will default to that weird animation of him feeling up the background that I covered in past videos. And here, you can also force the Yellow Rabbit to start chasing Oswald, and also trigger a sound lure pretty much anywhere you want. Then back to the left side here, next is extra speed, which unfortunately doesn't seem to work anymore. But thankfully, we still have this speed slider here that, as you'd expect, the higher you crank it, the faster Oswald will start to run. And honestly, running at top speed is pretty sweet. Heck, I think the walking speed at this setting is almost as fast as the default running speed. Reposition camera doesn't seem to do anything, likely because I wasn't messing with the camera. Battery plus 100 does exactly what it sounds like and will instantly refill your battery level to max. You can trip or fix the pizzeria generator whenever and wherever you want, as well as toggle almost all of the lighting on and off. Then the next option here lets you toggle the ability to show colliders, which is pretty cool to see. And with this enabled, yeah, you can basically see the collision planes of any objects that have collision. After this, there's a brightness slider, pretty self-explanatory. Should save didn't seem to do anything, and I was too afraid to even touch the clear data button here. Unlock endgame, I can't 100% confirm it, but it did seem to have instantly given me the 3 stars on the main menu, cause I sure as hell didn't unlock that normally. Like it sounds, show hint will make Oswald talk and give a hint about what the player needs to do next in the game. And then next we got what I think are the 2 most important features on this menu, the ability to load into any level and room in the game. Exactly how you'd expect, the top option here lets you load to any building in the game, as well as them on any night, making it extremely useful for getting to any section you want in the game really quickly. And then the move room option here lets you, obviously, move between rooms within a building. And this is extra useful in the pizzeria, as it also lets you bounce back and forth through time periods quickly as well. Then next we have Magic Vision, which honestly sounds a lot more interesting than it is, as basically it just creates a light on Oswald which can help you see in darker areas. What's also kinda interesting is that when you toggle it off, it doesn't actually remove the light, but it just freezes it wherever you disabled it. Then next up, we got a lot of debug text overlays which can be re-enabled. Version and scene shows you the version of the game that's being played, as well as the name of the room that you're currently in. The heart rate one unfortunately doesn't work, I guess since the mechanic was seemingly removed from the game. Breathing debug shows you a bunch of values for the breathing minigame used when hiding, and this will show you how long you're holding your breath, and how long Oswald is gasping until he can breathe again. Noise debug will show values for the overall noise level, as well as the decibel value for a given action. There's also text for a weak noise level, but I couldn't really seem to find any way to make it show anything but 0. Battery debug shows the flashlight battery life remaining twice actually, which is kinda redundant. And we can also see that the battery decay rate appears to be 2.25 points per second. And similarly for the generator debug text, we can see the amount of times the generator has already been tripped, as well as a countdown to the next trip, which appears to reveal that the time between trips is 1,320 seconds, or every 22 minutes. And last in this section is the option to enable debug text for achievements. And this appears to display counters for various achievements, like how many times you interact with the candy machine during cutscenes and more. Unfortunately though, although some like the dad item and action button counter work, the rest like the trip, light flickering, and candy machine interaction counters just don't. And interestingly, there's also a ticket counter here, but I guess this overlay was made at an earlier point in development where the tickets from the arcade machines just weren't implemented yet. Now next, there's one debug option which I skipped over, and it ties to the next section, as it's for the fabled insanity mechanic which was mostly scrapped from the game. So here you can set Oswald's insanity level from none all the way to high, and it looks like each step would equate to 25% increments in insanity. And I was curious how this percentage would go up, and it looks like every time you'd enter a hiding spot, it would go up by 1%. And if you're curious like I was to see if anything happens when you hit 100% insanity, unfortunately, it's a whole lot of nothing. Anyways, here we can see a whole bunch of other effects that were planned for this mechanic, but unfortunately, save for the random jump scares, the others shown don't seem to work. But we do have some pretty interesting sounding ideas here, like a fake Bonnie spawning, fake NPCs, which may be the ghost kids that sometimes show up in the arcade, a fake chase, fake TV shutoff, as well as a fake title card, which sounds like the game would have faked out a reset to the title screen or something, which I think would have been an awesome fourth wall break, like what was seen in the Psycho Mantis fight in Metal Gear Solid, where the game tries to trick you into thinking your console was disconnected. Then other things here include a permanent heart rate increase that would increase with each level of insanity, but with that mechanic being scrapped and it not seemingly affecting the sound meter at all, it doesn't seem to work here. There's a darkness increase timer that doesn't seem to function at all, unless you're in a screen transition for some reason, but even then it doesn't seem to do anything. And lastly, we got an entry for some idle glitch with a timer for it as well. And based on the name and timer, I guess if you were to be idle for a minute, some sort of insanity glitch would occur, but unfortunately this seems to have been removed. So yeah, although there seem to be some remnants of the insanity mode left over in the game, like the random jump scares, and I know I got at least a TV jump scare that I think is a remnant as well, it does look like there was originally much more to this mechanic than what we ultimately got. Anyways, after this we have another debug overlay, and in addition to showing the God mode status, it also appears to detail various aspects of both the Yellow Rabbit, or Golden Bonnie as it's referred to here, as well as Chica, including things like what their current action is, which room they're in, what their target location, room, and coordinates are, as well as their distance from the target. It's honestly pretty cool to see how active the two are even if they aren't in the same room as the player. And additionally, enabling this debug toggle will also cause a large circle to appear around the Yellow Rabbit, and I'm assuming this is an indicator of his range of sight and hearing. Just thought it was pretty cool to see this visualized. Next is an option to toggle a developer console, but unfortunately both this as well as the prompt to press the escape key to enter a command don't seem to function at all, at least in this build of the game. Return to menu is pretty self-explanatory, then after this is an option for the hiding minigames, where you can quickly load to any of them in the game and you can set a difficulty level between easy, medium, and hard. What's also interesting is that every single one of these hiding minigames is referred to as it being a breathing minigame, perhaps suggesting that originally the breathing or heart rate mechanic was planned to be used on all of them. Next we have Show AI Info, which is very similar to the previous debug overlay we went over, as it basically just displays info for the Yellow Rabbit again. But here it also details exactly how far away he is from Oswald, how many rooms away, percentage chance that he'll find Oswald, a hiding spot reuse penalty that doesn't seem to function, and more. After this, there's a quick save and quick load option, but I don't think they work, as after pressing quick save, it basically soft locked the game and had Oswald just sliding around, preventing me from interacting with anything, which was honestly really weird. Next, we have an inventory section where you can scroll through a list of all of the game's items, both the used ones as well as all of the unused ones that I mentioned in my last video, and you can add them to your inventory, remove them if you so choose, as well as this gives you the option of completely clearing out your inventory as well. Then after this, we have the ability to load into any of the objectives throughout the game, and this is basically the same as the other loading level section from before, only with this one, you can progress through the objectives unlike the previous one, where you'll load into another area with the same objective you had before. So if you warp to an area before or after where you were in the game, you may run into problems progressing. And then lastly for this page is a Freddy peeking debug section, where you can play around with values associated with Freddy appearing in the game to block a door. You can set the chance that he'll be at a door, how long he'll peek for, as well as the minimum and maximum cooldown time. So of course, I went ahead and set the chance to 100, and it was pretty wild, as Freddy would basically constantly appear at one door in a given room. And if the room only has one door, well, I hope you like Freddy peeking in, cause that's all he's gonna be doing. Oh, and I also tried setting the duration to an unreasonable length, and this will just have Freddy blocking the door for as long as you set it. And I guess what was also interesting to see here is that the default values are a 20% chance that he'll appear at a door in a room, he'll peek for 3 seconds, and then there's anywhere between a 25 and 40 second cooldown between each appearance. Which I guess kind of explains why he's fairly uncommon to come across in the game, at least I found. And although that's it for this page, we're not done here yet, as let me introduce you to page 2. As you can see, it has way less options to play around with, but they're still pretty cool. We again have an item section, but this one is much easier to use, as instead of scrolling through a small list and having to click another button to add or remove them, here you can just toggle a checkbox beside each item to add or remove it, and interestingly, you can also give Oswald a ladder item here, so you can bring it to areas that you normally can't in the game. Then after this, we have an ending checker debug option, which appears to show the requirements for getting the game's better endings, including finding all of the dad items, repairing the arcade machines, and clearing the 3 secret ones, which can be useful if you're trying to unlock all of the endings legitimately. What's also cool here is that it refers to the Fast Food Invader and Shoot the Spice Balloons arcade games as Galaga Machine and Asteroids Machine, essentially confirming that those classic games were their inspiration. And also related to the endings, here you can straight up just load right into either the neutral, good, or true ending. So if you don't feel like putting the time and effort into getting them legitimately, or just watching them on YouTube, you can just get to them quickly this way. And then lastly, for the debug menu and this video, we have the option to load into any of the arcade minigames, which is obviously handy if you didn't repair any of them, or if you just want to skip right to some of the secret ones without doing any of the prerequisites. But probably the most interesting thing you can do with this section of the menu is actually load into an unused arcade game titled Guard Duty. And I teased this back in the first video, as this is the minigame that was actually going to use the otherwise unused pixel sprites of the original 4 animatronics. The idea of this minigame is that the player here, who was originally planned to be Vanny, has to bring candy to each of the animatronics quickly, and the longer you don't, they'll start to get more and more red. The catch is, though, this seems to be an arcade game that was planned to be unwinnable, as over time, your character's movement will get progressively slower and slower until you basically can't move. And yeah, since you can't deliver the candies to the fellas, you end up just losing the game. Being an unused arcade game, this doesn't seem like it's fully complete here. But had it been left normally in the game, I wonder where it would have fit in, and what lore significance it may have had. In any case though, I think it's still really cool to actually see these arcade sprites used in action. Alright, so to kick things off for this video, let's actually start with some of the differences which can be seen in this early dev build of Into the Pit. And if you're interested, I made a little video a while back going over how a bunch of fans in the community helped get this build preserved. Anyways, first, let's go over at least a few of the more major changes seen in this early dev build compared to the Steam release version of the game. Of course, there's a whole bunch of minor stuff too that you'd expect, like having different option settings on PC compared to the Switch, as is typical between PC and consoles, as well as different button prompts appearing in the game for the Switch Joy-Con here, but some of these also go a bit deeper than that too. For instance, in the release build on Steam, whenever there's a QuickTime event in which you have to mash a button, a circle timer will appear around the button that you have to keep pressing, while in the early Switch build, the timer just isn't there at all. Well, at least for some of them, as some events still do have the timer, which I think only makes it weirder. And speaking of which, oddly enough, during Night 3 in the game, where you have to play Bonnie's guitar to distract him, while the release version of the game actually requires you to press certain buttons or keys to strum the guitar, in this early version you can actually just press any of the 8 main face buttons on the controller. I honestly kinda like it this way too, since Oswald seems to play pretty poorly, so I think the game not caring what buttons you press would add to it seeming like Oswald has no idea what he's doing. But the section may also just be unfinished, so this may not have been intentional. Then another button-related thing is for the screenshot function that's seen after finishing one of the games in the arcade. And I guess this function wasn't properly implemented yet, as trying to take a screenshot by pressing the R button on this dev Switch version will just cause the game to crash. The Switch, of course, also has a dedicated button that you can press to just take a screenshot whenever. But I guess the mechanic in this build just wasn't integrated with how the Switch handles screenshots or something. And while we're chatting about the arcade games, in addition to the input icons being different, it looks like the actual font is different as well, in the early version being slightly more similar to old arcade games like Pac-Man, instead of the more VHS looking font that the devs ended up going with. And to add to this, in the Freddy Fazbear slide puzzle game, the early dev build here doesn't actually have the best time part added yet. Next up, we talked about tutorial stuff at length in my previous videos, but there's another small but interesting difference here for that too. So in the normal release version, the game actually forces the player to open up the map at the start of the game when first getting to the pizzeria, as well as it forces the player to turn on the flashlight when you first get it from Jeff. And you basically can't do anything until you prove to the game you know how to use these. Well, in the early dev build here, the game doesn't force you to do either, so I guess the developers really wanted to make sure that players knew how to use the map and flashlight, and honestly, as someone that usually just mashes through text and stuff, this seems like something I'd skip over, so personally, I don't mind it. Then another thing I touched on in my previous videos is the heart rate hiding minigame, which was scrapped from the final game. Well, it's still actually implemented and playable in this leaked dev build when Oswald hides from the Yellow Rabbit in a vent. And when brought up, we can see that it was going to essentially be a rhythm game. It's pretty straightforward, the heartbeat line moves across the screen and you just have to try your best to move the heart up and down to match the line movements. Now every time you mess up, even a little, the line will flash red, and then the heart icon will actually start to crack, deeper and deeper with each mess up, and these are actually the otherwise unused heart icons that I mentioned in my previous videos too. So I guess this is where they ended up being used, only to end up getting scrapped. I think this heartbeat minigame is honestly pretty fun, albeit kinda challenging actually. It's very unforgiving with how precise you have to be with the heart movement, but I still like it more than the spider swatting that I guess ended up replacing this minigame here in the final version. Well, to add to that, the spider swatting hiding minigame is still in this dev build, but here it actually works slightly differently. In the release version, you just have to press the key or button once, but in this early dev build, you actually have to hold the button for a little bit, and honestly, I find this adds to the tension a little bit more than just pressing a key once. Now those are most of the gameplay differences, but we also have a few changes in the menus as well. For one, although these secret achievements appear in the release version's main menu as slots with a bunch of question marks, the secret achievements just don't appear at all in the early dev build. And in a similar vein, I guess the secret achievements just weren't fully implemented yet, as although you can still unlock them in the game, after you do, if you check the achievement list in the pause menu, for all of these secret achievements, both the name and description will just appear as ERR04, which almost seems like it could be on brand for the achievements, but yeah, this just looks to be an error of some sort. Then after this, probably one of the screens that you see most frequently in this game is the loading screen between areas in a building. And oddly enough, this is different in this version as well. Well, completely different actually, as in the Steam version, there's a whole lot of nothing when loading between rooms. While in the early dev build, we have these ball pit balls that bounce and roll on the bottom right of the screen. Now, I'm not sure if this just isn't seen on the Steam version since it loads so much faster than the Switch, and of course I'd rather have shorter load times, but this animation is still pretty slick. Now next, another pretty big difference can be seen, or rather heard, with the result of dialing a secret number in the phone in the game. So in the release build, if you call the number 777-4648, which corresponds to the letters Spring T on the phone keypad, which is obviously the start of the word Springtrap, you will actually get to hear a rather disturbing secret bit of audio of what seems to be William Afton getting crushed up into Springtrap. If you haven't heard it yet for yourself, this is what it sounds like. Well, in this dev build, if you call this exact same number, a completely different bit of audio will play, with much less screaming. Now, right off the bat, I don't recognize this ringtone sound as anything else from the series, but I'm willing to bet that some of you might, so if you do recognize this melody, please let us know what it is in the comments. And that's not all for different secrets in this build either, as there appears to be another pair of them found that seem to, for whatever reason, have been removed completely from the final release build of the game. First off, in this dev build, there's a small, around 3% chance that whenever you enter the ball pit room in Jeff's Pizza, a shadow of Eleanor, as seen in the one Secret to Be Beautiful arcade game, can be seen haunting the room just behind the pit. Now, I remember seeing a reference to the sprite in the game a few weeks ago listed as an Easter egg, but toggling it on and off didn't seem to change anything in the release build of the game. But yeah, we can still see this normally in action in the dev build here. And then similarly, by now you might have already heard about the little Easter egg in Oswald's room where after not moving at all for 10 minutes, a shadowy figure known as Stitch Wraith will appear in the window and will disappear if you get too close to it. Well, it turns out that there was actually another section where Stitch Wraith was once planned to have appeared, which was scrapped. Much like the Eleanor Easter egg or other random chance ones like Balloon Boy or Cam 1280 appearing in the security office, there would seemingly have been a random chance that Stitch Wraith would actually creepily appear on the side of the school. Now, unfortunately, unlike the Shadow Eleanor Easter egg, functionality for this one is disabled, even in the dev build. But with this leftover sprite, it can actually still be modded back in, even in the Steam version. And just from a perspective basis, the size of just Stitch Wraith's head sprite here would mean that it would be like taller than a whole floor of the building here, so that could also explain why this Easter egg was removed. And even like this, the full sprite of Stitch Wraith isn't seen, and if you were curious, here is what it looks like in full. And interestingly, to add to all of this, although unused, there is also leftover functionality for this Stitch Wraith Easter egg as well. As when modded back in, by standing near the bottom right of this area, you can interact with it, and by doing so, you'll actually load right into the also scrapped Guard Duty arcade game, which I covered in my previous video. So yeah, I guess this Stitch Wraith secret Easter egg here was going to be how this arcade game was planned to have been accessed. Also, I just went and double checked, and oddly enough, although it seems like the actual asset files for both the unused Shadow Eleanor and this second Stitch Wraith sprite are still left over in the final cut of the game, the sprites themselves seem to just have been erased, which is pretty weird. In any case, although it's unclear why exactly these secret appearances were cut from the game, there's no denying that they would have been pretty creepy to come across. And now lastly, probably the biggest difference of them all is that you can't actually even beat the game in this dev build. Yeah, for some reason, in Night 4, in the security office section, after you inspect the cameras and back out of them, Oswald will start to sink through the floor and slip into the void, effectively soft-locking the game. And well, since you need to use the cameras here to try and distract the yellow rabbit in this section, yeah, you can't actually progress past this point in the game. So honestly, knowing this, I'm not surprised that this build got pulled from the Nintendo eShop shortly after it was released early by mistake. And now, switching gears, as I teased in my previous video, although the game itself is unbeatable, there's actually a whole pit full of unused early maps left over in the files, with some of them being pretty dang cool and featuring various graphics that didn't go on to be used in the final game. So first, let's start with Oswald's home, and here there are actually several early areas that go unused. And interestingly, these are scrapped rooms for the home that could still be seen in the debug menu that's left over in the final game, even though their files were actually removed. These unused areas include a bathroom, garage, as well as a backyard area that I guess the player was once planned to visit. Anyways, first up we have the backyard area, and as you can see, this appears to actually be a very early leftover, as although flipped horizontally, this actually seems to be the very early basement background graphic that I mentioned in one of my first videos. Aside from the early furnace, chest, and open window here, there's not really much else for us to see. But if we open this door, it will actually take us to the next scrapped area, the garage. Which, yeah, as you can see, looks almost identical to the previous room, just with different lighting, as well as an added door on the back wall. Now obviously this doesn't look like a garage, and the previous room doesn't look like a backyard, so it seems like these aren't the original intended backgrounds for these areas. And then in a similar fashion, the last unused area, the bathroom, also doesn't appear to have any sort of bathroom background, but rather the early version of Oswald's bedroom that I've also brought up in past videos. And although again, this doesn't show a new area which we couldn't see in the final game, it's still really cool to actually be able to play in this early version here. And there's actually some more functionality in this room, as we can flip on and off the light here, as well as the lava lamp. And then last up for Oswald's home, it's not an unused area per se, but left over in this dev build is actually a scrapped minigame that would have taken place here, once again in the basement. As soon as we load into this game, we're given the instructions to navigate the darkness with, I guess, our flashlight, and then press the A button on an object of interest, with some being dangerous. And by dangerous, it just means you'll get a quick little jump scare from the yellow rabbit if you find his icon around the basement. Sometimes it's just in the open, but it can also be found not so hidden behind this little TV, or this bouncin' turkey. But besides getting jump scared, these don't really seem to do anything to end the game. Also to add to these, there's this randomly placed jack-in-the-box marionette thing that can jump scare you as well. And it doesn't mention this in the instructions, but the actual whole goal of this minigame is for us to find a screwdriver in the basement here and press A to grab it. And I guess this also reveals that instead of just finding the screwdriver in the pizzeria basement, originally the player was going to find it at home. And in my previous videos, I also brought up how originally the player needed to get pliers to save the kid in the pizzeria instead of the screwdriver, so the screwdriver being obtained here might have been for something else, if not for just unscrewing the vent covers. And to add to all of that, in this scrapped minigame we can also see various interesting sprites that I don't think are seen anywhere else in the game. And some of these are the sprites that went on to remain left over unused in the final build of the game, as I covered in my previous videos, including the piece of cheese, the party horn, as well as the night guard suit. Although it's left in a functional state, with the basic looking timer bar and seemingly unfinished placements of the yellow rabbit icons, yeah, this minigame doesn't seem quite finished, and I guess it was abandoned in this state when the plans on how to obtain the screwdriver were changed. Regardless though, still a pretty cool minigame to find left over here. Now before moving on to the pizzeria, I was actually surprised to see some early maps left over for the school area. First, we have the entrance area to the school, and here we can actually see these railing things that in previous videos I mentioned were left over unused and hidden there. But what's most different in this early version of the school is that unlike the final version where it's one long big area, this early version actually has the hallway split into 3 separate maps that you have to load between. And much like the previous unused areas in Oswald's home, here too these early maps appear to use the early background graphics, and we can also see different sprites and their placement as well. The doors are different, there aren't any foreground objects, we have lockers here instead of chairs on the left side, and way more lockers in the middle than are seen in the final version. Furthermore, these locker sprites are actually the early versions of them that went on to go left over unused in the final build of the game. And before we go on, just want to quickly shout out my channel members like Stuffy Ant and Rox's Gamepad. These videos took a very long time to make, so if you're enjoying my content and would like to help support me and the channel, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below, and you'll get some nifty channel perks. And now finally, moving on to the pizzeria section of the game, let's start off with the unused counter room which I covered in my previous videos, as the past version of this room is where the unused pizzeria employee character was going to be seen. Anyways, the present version isn't all too interesting here, but we do get to see this refrigerator object misplaced as it's like stuck on the ceiling. Might want to get that checked out, Jeff. And aside from the scrapped animations and dialogue for the employee, which I covered in previous videos, it's also revealed that the door on the left here would apparently lead to the kitchen. And in case you're wondering why the employee sprite reverts back to Jeff sometimes, it's probably since there's no yawning animation for the employee, so it just defaults back to using Jeff's instead. What was also kinda strange that I saw here is that only in the Night 5 version of this area, there looks to be a very basic looking sprite of a cup and saucer here that I don't think I've seen anywhere else in the game. Surprisingly, you can't interact with it or anything, but just thought it was something interesting to note. Then, after this counter area, we have what's listed as Hallway 1. I don't think there's an equivalent of this area in the final pizzeria, but based on its layout, I guess it's most similar to the party hallway. In the present Jeff's Pizza version of this area, we can see it looking pretty neglected, as is expected, and in addition to seeing the outlines of some foreground objects here, there's also this poster of the mediocre Melodies animatronics that's all worn down, and I don't think the game uses this poster sprite anywhere else. Surprisingly, there isn't one in better shape in the past version of this area, as the poster is replaced with the classic Celebrate poster instead. But yeah, it's still really cool to see a nod to the Mediocre Melodies crew, but it's a shame this poster ended up getting cut from the game. Oh, also, there's this scrap of paper on the ground that flips up when you walk over it, definitely trying to get the player's attention, but unfortunately you can't interact with it or anything, but I'd be willing to bet that this was supposed to be one of the pieces of the kid's drawing item that was cut from the game. Moving on, next up we have Hallway 2, and as I teased in my last video, this is actually the old version of the storage room with the Golden Freddy suit, where it was originally a much bigger room than how it's seen in the final. Now, despite the larger size though, it basically serves the same function, so I can see why this was cut down. We do also have a few more interesting things here though. In the present version, there's a large unit here that looks to have been a sound mixer of some sort, which is described as DJ equipment. And then there's also this alternate version of the Fredbear's Family Diner poster seen in the storage room, with this one seemingly featuring Spring Bonnie instead of Fredbear, and I believe this ended up getting scrapped from the game as well. Then in the past version of this room, we can see the early TV sprites, the unused poster here, and most interestingly, by actually entering the Golden Freddy suit here, it will trigger an old cutscene of the start of the game where you play hide and seek in the pizzeria. And soon after, we can actually see an old tutorial graphic pop up on screen. Yep, just like I covered in my previous videos, before being changed to a much less obtrusive pop-up on screen, originally these tutorial graphics would have apparently popped up. And here, we can see the icons of Bonnie being alerted as well as these footsteps, which both went on to go unused in the final release. Whichever method of tutorials popping up you prefer, it's still really cool to see this left over in action here. And then, once the power goes out here, we get to try an early version of the breathing minigame in the suit. And as you can see, the visuals aren't exactly finished. And although the yellow rabbit is still masked out around the eyes, the background appears as just one graphic, so it looks pretty goofy to say the least. And unfortunately, once you survive hiding from the yellow rabbit, the game just soft locks you here as you can't exit the suit after this. So yeah, obviously this scene wasn't exactly finished. And then, in a similar fashion, specifically in the Night 1 version of this room, if you approach the slightly opened door on the left with a seemingly bloody trail leading up to it, you'll actually end up getting this goofy-looking static jump scare, if you want to call it that, from the yellow rabbit.
Mom said it's my turn on the Xbox.
And also for this room, there's an early version of the sticky hand vent opening cinematic that ended up being moved to the right side of the party hallway in the final game. But yeah, here it takes place on the left, and Oswald gets jump scared by nothing before he tries to climb into the vent. And he'll just keep trying this forever as the cutscene just locks up here. And now, since I've mentioned all the relevant rooms at this point, the Night 2 versions of both Hallway 2 here, as well as the front counter, feature a trail of visible stinky green gas, and this would have actually led the player to a vent back in Hallway 1. And opening it would reveal the scrapped rotten pizza item that I also covered in previous videos. And you can actually still pick it up in this build too, and it will also still get added to your inventory. After this, we now have Hallway 3, which is only left over in this build starting from Night 2. And honestly, this room, both the present and past versions, are mostly unremarkable as they're pretty similar to Hallway 1. With the big exception being that in the past version of this room, if you interact with the paper pals on the back wall, you'll actually end up picking up a piece of the kid's drawing, which, as mentioned in previous videos, was a set of collectible items which were cut from the game. So, just like the rotten pizza, it's really cool to get an idea where these items would have been found, not to mention to be able to actually pick one up too. Then also for Hallway 3 here, the Night 3 version of this room will actually cause a short cutscene to play, where Oswald mentions that something, I guess maybe the vest on the floor that's added here on this night, is his dad's. And then, after approaching the door, a creepy shadow can be seen walking behind the door's window. And I don't recall seeing this animation normally used in the game, and I guess this figure is supposed to be Freddy, as Oswald will then talk about needing to find Freddy's weakness. And following Hallway 3, we have the last hallway in this quadrilogy, Hallway 4, in which both the present and past versions seem incomplete, as the background graphic just gets cut off on the right, and there's really nothing left in here, at least visually. What is pretty creepy about this area is that every few seconds a pretty unsettling bit of audio will play, and it sounds like a reversed scream or something. I was curious, and if you are too, here's what the audio sounds like reversed. Yeah, pretty weird to say the least. Next up, we have old versions of the office room, and if you've been watching the series since part 1, you probably won't be surprised to hear that the background from the old FNAF 3 inspired security office is used here in the present version of this room, or rather, an updated version of it, suggesting that the plans to keep the FNAF 3 inspiration went beyond the Super Nintendo style plans for the game. And even with basically nothing in here, it just looks and feels so unsettling. The past version of this room is also empty, but it uses the slightly more updated background style, and as you can see, it's much harder to actually see anything here. Then next up, one of my favorite unused rooms here are the back door rooms, which are very likely early versions of Afton's secret room. Minus the change of background graphics, the layout of the objects is basically the same between the two versions here. And yeah, as you can see, with this annoying smoke or whatever it is, it's much more difficult to see anything in the present version of this area. But anyways, here we got a bunch of unused sprites which I mentioned in previous videos, including the old arcade machines, chairs, as well as that weird poster on the back wall. Still trying to figure out just what the hell this is supposed to be. Although I think the killer room in the final version of the game looks quite a bit better, I still think it's really cool to see this original version of it left over in this dev build like this. Then after those, another thing I mentioned in some previous videos is that there were several unused images which appear to have been from a scrapped security camera section of the game, where the area that was being recorded seemed very much inspired by the first Five Nights at Freddy's game. Well, it turns out that there's actually a whole unused section left over for this security camera bit, and here we can actually see all of these images in action. Here you cycle through the different cameras, and then eventually you'll see Chica, and then later the yellow rabbit walking and stopping in front of the camera, and then through the next camera we can see his eyes glowing in the distance before ultimately we get a nice little jump scare. Now, the footage you've been seeing so far is actually from the release build of the game, but this section is also left over in this dev build too, where, as you can see, there's a noticeable amount of orange here. Now, I don't think this is intentional, and it's more likely that something got messed up with the color palette, but either way, this black and orange palette is honestly kind of a vibe. Oh, and one other difference in the dev build version of this section is that once you do get jump scared here, instead of fading to black, the game will just soft lock at the end of the animation, So you just get to stare at the yellow rabbit's pearly whites until you reset the game. I probably said the same thing last time, but I think the security camera functionality we ended up getting in the final game was fairly forgettable and not really useful. So I think whatever the plans were here with this would have been awesome to see. Now that's pretty much all of the early maps that I came across, but there might be a few that I missed considering there's like 700 different map files left in this dev build. Now one more map I wanted to touch on though, since it got brought up a few times in the comments on my last video, is the Night 99 map that could still be seen in the debug menu. Well, it appears that this sounds a lot more interesting than it is, as Night 99 looks to actually just be the version of the arcade room that you enter from the extras option on the main menu. So yeah, sorry to burst anyone's bubble that thought this was something more interesting than that. And now, last up for this video, in addition to all of those unused early maps, there's actually also an early version of the Skee-Ball arcade game left over too. Yeah, as you can see, it looks completely different than how it's seen in the final game, and in fact, it appears to be using what looks to be an updated version of the old Super Nintendo style background sprite for it, which I covered back in the first video of this miniseries. Although the game is playable here, it's actually incredibly difficult to get the ball into any of the higher point holes. And unfortunately, once you lose this game, the game will actually soft lock on this game over screen. Then other changes here include the ball straight up just being a red circle, the power meter only has 3 stages, and then the meter for the angle of the throw uses a unique sprite that ended up getting scrapped. And although it seems like points are tracked, the actual score counter doesn't work at all. And lastly, oddly, the number of balls left is referred to as lives instead, which is honestly a weird choice of words to use here, I think. Now, it certainly may not look as pretty, but hey, much like all of the other early rooms left over in this build, I think it's awesome to not only see this left in the game, but the fact that we can still play it too is super cool. Honestly, it still blows me away how lucky we got with this dev build leaking out to the public the way that it did. Alright, and if that wasn't enough for you, here's a little bit of bonus content for those of you that stuck around to the end here. So in the earlier videos, I went over the unused achievement icons, but it turns out that in addition to just the icons, there's also some leftover unused text for a few of them, which reveal what the criteria was planned to be for obtaining those achievements. For the Take the High Ground achievement, there's leftover text which reveals that the player had to finish Night 2 on normal or higher difficulty. It seems pretty weird for there to be an achievement for just finishing Night 2, unless at one point the game only did have 2 nights, which also seems like it would be too short, so yeah, this one's kinda strange. And although there doesn't seem to be text for the 1 and 3-star achievement variants, based on their similarity, I think it's almost certain that the bronze one would be for finishing Night 2 on an easy difficulty, and the 3-star one for hard difficulty. Next we have this eavesdropper achievement, and this one would have been unlocked by listening to all the hidden recordings. Now there aren't any recordings in the final game, so maybe these ended up being changed to the phone guy's calls. Then after that is text for the What's This For achievement, and just like I suspected, this would have been unlocked for finding a battery in the game before obtaining the flashlight. The Get to Safety achievement would have been unlocked by simply watching the ending. Although Eavesdropper mentions recordings, the Hello Operator achievement would require the player to answer the phone in the pizzeria. The Game Master achievement would require the player to beat all 3 arcade games, which seems to reveal that Into the Pit originally just had 3 arcade games to play, which is way less than what's seen in the final release. Also, most of the arcade games are score attack in nature, with very few of them beatable outside of the 3 secret ones, so perhaps those are what this is referring to. Next is the Noisemaker achievement, which would have apparently required the player to interact with every object in the game. Now, I'm assuming this means every object that can be used as a noisemaker, as interacting with every single possible object that you can would be quite tedious, but honestly, who knows? Next, we have this icon for the scrapped blood pressure achievement, and I was really hoping this one would have been for the heart rate mechanic that was seemingly cut from the game, but apparently this one would have been pretty easily unlocked by just successfully hiding from Spring Bonnie. Yeah, not all that groundbreaking after all. Then we got the That's How They Get You achievement, which would have been unlocked by inspecting the spring traps. An obvious reference to Springtrap, but whatever these spring traps were, they seem to have been cut from the game. Then there's Quick Memory, which I definitely thought was going to be related to the previous achievement, but the criteria for this one was to finish the phone minigame on the first attempt. And yeah, this phone minigame seems to be another minigame which was scrapped. And although you do enter the Eleanor minigame via Oswald's cell phone, I don't believe that was for this achievement, as neither the name nor the icon seem to be related to it at all. And speaking of Eleanor, last up we have the To Be Beautiful achievement. And this one would have apparently been unlocked by simply inspecting the necklace sitting in garbage. And based on this, it seems like this was before the Eleanor minigame was added to the game, as in the final game, that's where you see the necklace. But based on this text, apparently the necklace was once planned to be found in some trash, presumably behind the mill, serving as a more subtle reference to the To Be Beautiful story from Fazbear Frights than the whole minigame we ended up getting. And honestly, I think that would have been a good upgrade if that was the case. But on the other hand, the necklace in trash would have been a pretty cool reference too to the original story, as the main character, Sarah, ends up turning into a pile of junk. There's also the possibility that interacting with this necklace would have been the original way to enter into the Eleanor minigame, but unfortunately, at this point, with the information we have, it's not 100% clear. Anyways, my friends, that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this massive compilation, and shoutouts to you if you made it to the end here. This was definitely a pit of unused content that was a ton of fun to explore. If you enjoyed this video and are looking for several hours more, check out some of my other long compilations, and be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell to find your way back to the channel in the future. And as always, thank you all so much for stopping by today, and I will see you in a bit.